whom we are all looking forward to hearing on a book which has been edited by one of our speakers, Kazi Khalid Ashraf, and Amitav Ghosh, the novelist, has contributed a foreword to that book, which is an extraordinary, extraordinary book. And I look forward to hearing more about the book, its genesis, and how it developed from our two speakers, because I think that this conversation will carry on some of the themes that were broached in an earlier session here at the KLM, where Amitabh was in conversation about the planetary crisis, about resources, and about Deltaic Bengal. Uh, I'd like to begin, if I may, by asking Kazi about the genesis of this book, which is called The Great Padma. Let me just start by saying that for those who do not know, that the Padma is a river of East Bengal, uh, which bifurcated from the Ganga as it came down through the Gangetic Plain from the Himalayas. The one large stream entered East Bengal, and the other continued in West Bengal. And this story, the story of this bifurcation, is told by Krittibash Ojha in his Ramayana, where the word Padma is used perhaps for the first time, Poddavati. So this beautiful couple of lines which Kazi quotes in his introductory chapter. Let me ask a little bit about that genesis and what distinguishes the Padma from the Ganga, the Podda from the Ganga.
Thank you, Supriya Di. Is the okay? Can you hear me now? Thank you. Thank you for um, this session to Kolkata Literary Meet. Sure. Okay. And thank you, Amitav Ghosh, Amitav, for being here and writing the preface to the book, and Supriyadi for, I hope, generating a conversation on a river, which I'm not sure from this side of the Delta, on the western side of the Delta, and from Calcutta, uh, how far we know about the Podda. I mean, that's another sort of, reason that I wanted to work on the river because it has laid in obscurity, a narratival obscurity. I mean, the river itself is just an immense river. Even if you look at photographs and if you have the chance to be on the banks of the Podda at any point from its origin, it's an ambiguous origin though, you can't really determine where the Podda starts to its meeting in the estuary. It's an immense, and I've often described it as oceanic because you can't see the other side of the river, other bank. So the book actually emerged as, how do we talk about rivers? And how do you talk about a deltaic river with a very particular property and character? It's meandering, it's oscillating, there is seasonal flux, there's annual flux, monsoonal flux. One year it's going down in a particular direction, and in a couple of years it may have shifted a few miles. It's an amazing force of nature, which some people have described it as geography in action. Um, well, the river also is. I mean, you already mentioned that its relationship to Ganga, which is actually precisely the reason that I think I took this up as a book project, because I mention in the book that the Podda or Padma, if you like, is the Ganga and the Padma is not. Meaning it's the waters of the Ganges which flows through directly and creates the same river, the same waters, but it's a whole different ecology. It's from the point that where the delta actually starts, from a riverine behavior of the Ganges all the way from its source, from central India. And at some point, it becomes another phenomenon, which is the deltaic phenomenon. It fractures into multiple distributaries, channels, and with the silt and water, it's a phenomenon that's incredible, and which has created the delta for 20,000 years or so. But then again, from some point, it's known as the Podda, and it's where the forking happens. I've described the Ganga forks into the main channel that I describe as the Podda, and then the other channel, which is equally famous, Hooghly Bhagirathi, which then also, in the narratival sense, is claimed as the Ganga. So I realized that there are many books on the Ganges. Every other year there's a scholarly book or a photographic book or journalistic book. But I realized that there is a kind of, what I mentioned earlier, obscurity. Podda is hardly mentioned. I think somehow the narrative takes a direction towards Hooghly Bhagirathi, and Podda is missed. But Podda is the flow of the Ganges. The other thing that I was really thinking about is that in the narrative of the Ganges, it's always the source, the origin that is glorified, celebrated, and has taken on a mythological stature, obviously. Um, but how the Ganga ends, there is not much about it. So where the Ganga, how the not where the Ganga ends, but how the Ganga ends is the delta, and that's where Podda begins. So that's in a sense it's a genesis, but also it's also related in a personal story. Is that I'm an architect. Why should I be writing on rivers? If I may quickly mention this, because these are the two reasons. One is the narratival obscurity of Podda, and the other is being in Bangladesh, an architect. I've gradually come to realize that, I've revised my understanding and perception of architecture from this one off sculptural object to something that is actually embedded in the landscape. And in Bangladesh, especially in the eastern Bengal, as you mentioned, in the delta, that embeddedness in the landscape means that particular landscape, the deltaic landscape, this flux between land and water. Um, and we need to understand that. I mean, you can't assume that the land will be stable forever. There is that oscillation, which I describe with a word that's actual word, terra aqueous land, right? Um, so I've taken that on. I can actually name the time when that happened. It happened with Hurricane Katrina in 2005. I was teaching in the U.S. Architecture, but the destruction that Katrina caused, that led many news reports to refer to Bangladesh, meaning that how people in Bangladesh are so resilient, but what happened to us? And I think that from that moment on, I took on architecture to its larger scale, its relationship to the landscape, and the larger ecological situation. And from then on, I remained quite obsessed, if you like, with being in the delta, in the context, in the situation with rivers.
Thank you. Thank you very much. That was a very moving account. I'd like to ask Amitabh, if I may, uh, about your relationship with Deltaic Bengal, uh, on which you've written an extraordinary novel, The Hungry Tide. I myself, at one time, I
by the Podda River. So my family had to leave. They decided to leave Bengal, and they traveled all the way to Bihar, where they finally settled in the town of Chhapra, where they lived, for 150 years after that. In fact, we had a family house in Chhapra until the 1990s. So we were, in a sense, environmental refugees before the word was invented, in a sense. And once your connection with your ancestral land is sort of disrupted in that way, I think people just keep on traveling. And that's really what happened to me. It's what happened to so many of my cousins who are now scattered all over the world. But curiously, my father also always used to say this, that every generation, no matter how far away they were, they would always go back to Bikrampur to marry.
Mhm.
Either Bikrampur or Puritpur. And it's an astonishing thing. I grew up listening to my grandmother speaking the dialect of Puritpur. Actually, it's Gopalganj now, which is where her village was from. And so I grew up the dialect. I knew it more or less. I used to hear it in my head. And then years and years later, I happened to be in Venice when I suddenly found that this dialect was being spoken all around me. It was such an extraordinary and moving experience to hear the language of your grandparents
Mhm.
suddenly being spoken by Bangladeshi migrants in Italy. And all of them actually a very large percentage of the migrants in Italy are actually from Bikrampur district.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much. I wanted to draw everybody's attention in this audience to the way in which this book is planned. If you have the chance to buy it, I really urge you to do that because it is extraordinary work of combination and curatorial brilliance, in the sense that it has photographs, illustrations, it has articles on various aspects of life along the banks of the Podda. It has articles on history, on cuisine, on travels, on migration, and so on. It also has a particular set of articles, which or essays, which are called titled collectively Jonopod. And these Jonopod, among which Bikrampur is one, Padma, Bikrampur, maybe Rajshahi. I'm not very sure with the number of these Jonopods. Many, most of these names are familiar to us. I too grew up listening to the East Bengal Bikrampur dialect spoken in my home, even by my Maharashtrian mother, who spoke the Bikrampur dialect far better than I am able to do today. And what I find quite remarkable about the book is the way in which it combines all these aspects of life around a river. And this is something that Kaji was suggesting might be called the river imaginary. I'd like to ask you, both of you, one by one, perhaps to tell us something about the river imaginary. What is it to have a river imaginary?
Well, in Bengal, as you yourself have written, there's a whole tradition of the river novel.
Yes.
I mean, it's a whole genre, we
Yes.
could say. Advaita Mallobarman
Yes.
wrote, I think, one of the greatest river novels ever.
Yes.
And I think to some degree, we all of us grow up with the idea of the river always in our heads because we grow up watching, we see it in films, we see it in Tagore's stories, and so on. To me, I must say, what was really sort of so incredibly interesting about the rivers of Bengal is that exactly as Kazi was saying, they are actually incredibly alive.
Yes.
You see geology happening in front of your eyes. Geological processes which elsewhere take like centuries at least, if not more. Here you see happening literally overnight. An entire riverbank gets swept away. Suddenly another sand. Oh, actually, there is another one here. Uh, Suddenly a sandbank will appear, new land comes, and the ways in which people live is really adapted to that. People learn to move with the water. They learn to adapt themselves to the water. Now, this was something which the British were very uncomfortable with. So they tried to impose certain kinds of order upon the rivers, with embankments and so on. Now, embankments are, all very well in other places, but in Bengal, they just actually led to all kinds of floods, various kinds of floods. So I think for me, the whole experience of seeing how rivers function in relation to land and in relation to people's livelihoods has always been incredibly fascinating.
I think you mentioned river stories, and of course, the most famous one about Padma is Manik Padmanabhan's Padma Nadir Majhi, and we have Gautam Ghosh here, Gautam Da, of course. I'm very happy that you're here. Um, so the river imaginary that I was thinking about is, I refer to the French writer Gaston Bachelard, his beautiful essay, Dreams and Water. How do you imagine, how do you think about water as a kind of in terms of material imagination? And he distinguished uh, river water or sweet water with ocean water. There's a different kind of imagination associated with the river because with the river, as he argues, it can be humanized, and therefore, in reciprocity, the rivers give to humans, unlike, as he argues, the ocean. Um, and Rabindranath also, there are many in his Chinno Patra Boli, especially. I just love that collection of letters to his niece. They are just incredible descriptions of the river, the chores, life on the river. And he makes a distinction between the river and other still water, Doba, Jalabhumi, Bil, Haur. He calls them Boba Pani, while the river has Chondo, has a rhythm and flow. So the river imaginary to me is about flow, number one. And immediately we have to rethink this. It's not just the flow of water, but it's the flow of sediment and silt also, especially in the delta. Not all rivers have the kind of sediment and silt as deltaic rivers in Bengal have. So that's something quite fascinating, and we hardly discuss that in the way that we would like to. But in Bengali we have the word poli, which is needed. You mentioned flooding. I don't use the word flooding anymore. I call flow and overflow. The overflow is needed. The farmers need it, the villagers need it, even the fishermen need it. When it overflows the banks, the sediment is deposited and little fish from the main river goes inland, and when the water recedes, that's when the wetlands are created, number one. And of course, the agricultural lands have the sediment overlaid. So I think a number of incredible sort of, in the cycle that the deltaic rivers have in their character is incredible. So but with silt, uh, some numbers have to be given.
Yes.
And we picked up an information by an English geologist in the 19th century, and he mentioned, and I think it can be calculated now, that annually the silt that flows from the mouth of from the point of the origin of the river Podda to its termination is equal to 350 pyramids. That's the amount of silt that's annually moving. And it's not just moving in one direction, it's moving in multiple directions. And of course, it's creating the land, it's creating flow, overflow, accretion, erosion. It's a dynamic situation. That's number one. Number two, well, the silt is not just stopping at the edge of the ocean. It goes then slowly under the Bay of Bengal, and it reaches all the way to the Indian Ocean. The amount of silt under the Bay of Bengal, that's also calculated now. It's more than the two Bengals put together. So there's it's called the subaqueous delta, technically by geologists. And they have there's a term there which is now in circulation, Bengal fan. So there's a Bengal fan under the Bay of Bengal, which the reach of it goes almost all the way to the equator. And we were just discussing with Amitav and Supriya that that has not been really deciphered, what that amount of silt is doing to the underwater dynamic.
If I just
Yeah.
could add
Yes.
something there. If you've never seen a map of the ocean floor of the Bay of Bengal, it's very easy to find one on the net. You really should have a look because
Mhm.
the underwater map of the Bay of Bengal is actually just a continuation of the Sundarban.
Yes.
You know, you have all these estuaries, you have inlets, tributaries, etc. It's an astonishing sight to see.
Yeah. In fact, I think, my former pupil Debjani Bhattacharya refers to the Gangetic Delta, this deltaic region, as a remnant oceanic basin. And that is, in fact, what it is. The amount of silt that is carried by the Brahmaputra, Meghna, Ganga, the three together, is four times the amount of silt that is carried by the Amazon, or maybe more, I'm not quite sure. And it is the largest deltaic system in the world. And also, of course, it's providing, sustenance to the largest population in the world. So the population of this region all depends on the flow of these rivers, which of course change course. Over time, the Ganga has been pushing eastward, while the flow of the Brahmaputra is pushing westward. And so, this is creating huge problems for what has been called the sedentary metaphysics of British geographers and colonial geographers, about whom you have written many times. So, this sedentary metaphysics is set at odds by the courses, the changing courses of these rivers, and what's been described as new mud, old mud, and marsh. That's what is there in the delta. I'd like to ask you, if I may, about what's been written about the lives of people. You mentioned Advaita Mallo Barmon's remarkable novel, which is, of course, about a river drying up. And the other day, Amitabh, you were speaking about Meghna drying up, the Meghna no longer, because of the Farakka barrage, no longer receiving that volume of water. That too is a problem. Not just the river overflowing and breaking its banks, but rivers drying up, changing course, being swallowed up by chores, uh, in Titash, at the start, the fishermen, the Malo fishermen, are happy to live in an ecology where there is this periodic inundation and the soil is fertilized and the river then recedes and so on. But then ultimately, something happens that is irreparable, that cannot be uh, changed, and they don't get their river back. So, would you like to say something about that?
Sure. Well, the problem with the embankments is that it prevents the silt, which is actually creates the fertility of Bengal. It prevents the silt from flowing out into the surrounding lands. I mean, which is actually what has happened with the Nile as well now since the Aswan High Dam. But the other problem again is that the embankments, when there's heavy monsoons, the embankments hold water back. It won't allow the water to drain out. So what you get is what are called jalabaddha lands where the water is held in and therefore becomes unproductive and it becomes sodden and so on. So you know over centuries of inhabiting this land, people learned to live with the ways in which with this fluctuating landscape, as it were, and that is what the British found very difficult. And in any case, even apart from embankments, they started building railroads on top of embankments. So what was once a fluid, watery landscape has now become, as it were, divided up in these ways, which is actually preventing its from supporting as many people as it once did. But the Farakka barrage, I think, is a particularly egregious example of something that's been very destructive. But I think maybe, Kazi, you should speak about that because certainly every time I've been in Bangladesh, people are just, I mean,
We'll ask you this question. No, I'm not going to be speaking about Farakka here. My visa doesn't allow that. But I think it's a more complicated story than what Supriya you mentioned, whether the flow of water has been disrupted or not. I mean, certainly in the Rajshahi region, we see a leaning of the waters, and then seasonally you have water. But then the flow from, we need to realize that the waters of Podda is not all from Ganga. Waters from Brahmaputra, Jamuna, and then there's from Meghna, and which has retained its flow so far. Somebody asked me a question: is the delta receding? I mean, just well, that's also difficult to talk about, but I guess we must talk about in the context of climate change, possible seawater rise. So on the one hand, less water from the Ganga side, and on the other hand, possible seawater rise and coastal erosion. These are, incredible facts of climate, environmental change, ecological transformation, which people have to deal with. And on top of that, major infrastructural rearrangement, which was really particularly initiated by the British in colonial times, then picked up by later governments. And even now, you mentioned creating these embankments, polarizing, in the islands in Sundarbans, in Bangladesh side, which the Dutch initiated because that's what they know. They know polders. Their delta is not the Bengal Delta. But right, so with polarizing, what happens is that the silt is not coming into the land, and the riverbed is rising because the silt is then just accumulating on riverbeds. And then, of course, with rain, that's collecting within the land itself. And because of this polarizing, people have shifted occupation from fishing in the rivers and the ocean to shrimp cultivation, which itself is damaging to the environment. So all this sort of not only natural changes, but also changes brought about by human installations. But I must also mention that we already referred to the colonial rearrangement at a large scale. Of course, the railways were the first big interventions in the landscape, because they were in embankments, and they really didn't calculate that, or perhaps they didn't care about where water is flowing from one direction to the other. So that was the first big disruption to the flows of the waters in Bengal. Um, Many of you may know the work of James Rennell, the map maker, cartographer, who, I mean, that's actually quite an incredible story. Right after the English took over after the Battle of Palashi in 1760, he was entrusted to find a river route from Calcutta to Dhaka. See, he was on a Bajra with 34 people, and he crisscrossed these small channels south of Calcutta, and then you entered the Sundarbans, and we went up north and to the Podda and to Dhaka, and from which came the first sort of, if you like, the modern map of Bengal. And then Rennell did a map of India, famous, or whatever it is, the map of Hindustan. The subtitle is interesting: in a theater of war and commerce. So the intention was actually to find navigational routes for reasons of commerce. So that's number one. And they really wanted to see the river perhaps as they saw the Thames, as the banks are solid, permanent, enduring. And so that map, I talk about that in the book, is both a representation of the river of that time, but it's also a fiction that rivers don't exist like that anymore. But we have adopted that. We use those maps as a way to represent this sort of unrepresentable rivers and landscapes. So, which is a challenge.
Yeah, that I think, is just putting your finger on it, trying to represent the unrepresentable. I also found it interesting that you mentioned the Bojra, in which James Rennell conducted his voyage, because there is a section in the book about boats. And the boats of the Podda are particularly beloved of the Bengali imagination. We have our own boat historian in Kolkata who's just concluded an exhibition of river boats from the Ganga and the Padma, Sharup Bhattacharya, but there's somebody else who's contributed to your book. And apart from that, I'd like to ask you about other efforts to control or to provide routes across rivers. The Podda Bridge, which has recently been completed. What do you think of the Podda Bridge? Because I have crossed the Podda too, but by boat, not by bridge.
I recently wrote a piece in an English newspaper. I called it Crossing the Padma.
Yes.
And you can take it in two ways. First, as an infrastructural movement, which bridges are, and before the new Podda Bridge, there's the Hardinge Bridge, which was built in 1915 at a shorter crossing of the Podda near Pabna, Ishurdi. But the current bridge it spans 6.2 kilometers. It's one of, and crossing the Padma. So it was a really, of course, an engineering challenge. So that's pragmatic, practical, and I suppose it was needed by both sides of the banks of the river. Previously, to take you crossing the Podda not less than 4 or 5 hours. You have to first of all you spend a lot of time waiting for the ferry. You're on queue, and then you have to cross. And I imagine I know how many lives and materials have been lost crossing the Podda. Unrecorded. So the crossing the Podda is a phenomenon itself. And and looking at that, I noted, and I was looking at the first instances where Podda is referred in literature, ancient literature, and there was this uh, poet, Buddhist poet, Bushuku, in the Charjapad. He writes about crossing the Podda. He mentions beautifully that he crosses the Podda from the south. He marries a Chandal woman. The next line is interesting. And I become a Bengali. Bangali hola. Chandal বিয়ে করে এবং পদ্মা cross করে. So to me, crossing the Podda then has become a phenomenon of becoming a Bengali. With
Thank you. Yeah. So, I wanted to, because we have to open it up shortly, but I just wanted to, because you mentioned the poet and you have written very beautifully about this Buddhist poet who crossed the Podda and became a Bengali. I wanted to ask Amitabh to comment on something that I mentioned right at the start, which is that the Ganga coming down from the Himalayas bifurcates. And this bifurcation is mentioned in our Bengali epic version of the Ramayana, written by Krittibash Ojha. And one stream is led down into West Bengal. The other stream, the larger one, Podda, is led into East Bengal. And both are guided by munis or religious, sages. The Podda Muni is the person who leads the Poddaboti River, the Lotus River, into East Bengal. And yet, the Ganga retains its sacral character, its sacred character. The Podda is not really a sacred river. Why is it not a sacred river? Why is it consigned to this fate? It's this extraordinary river which has its presence in our imaginations, in our culture, like the Brahmaputra, like the Damodar to some extent. But why is the same river? Why is the Podda not sacred while the Ganga is sacred?
Oh, I don't know that I can answer that, but one of the earliest versions of the Mongol Kabbo is actually called Padda Puran. And I wonder if there might be some sort of connection between Monasha Devi and the Padda River. I think that's certainly not impossible. But we can't forget that what the Padma is known for today in Bengal is, of course, the
Yes,
Ilish Mach. It's a fish.
yes.
But when I was in Bangladesh in last January, I was told that actually you can't get Ilish Mach in the Padma anymore.
Yes, yes. Well, it's actually a Padma Puran, not the Padma Puran,
The
Padma
Puran, yeah.
Puran. But anyway, I think that, while this discussion could go on forever and there's so much in the book that we could yet talk about, I think I now have to throw it open to the audience. If anybody would like to ask questions and draw our two speakers and writers out, please do so.
Yeah, hi. This is Aditya Basu. Uh, the story of Ganga and Padma, in a way, also reflects how the partition of Bangladesh and India, rather the partition of Bengal and like into West Bengal and East Bengal, right? So I believe politics also plays a part when it comes to conservation of the Ganges ecosystem and the diversity and the ecology, right? So, is there any joint effort being made by any group from Bangladesh and India or Bengal for preservation of the plain and the? I'm not talking about water distribution and not going into the politics, but any effort being made from both the parties to have a central group for improvement of the region and improvement over the overall river system, joint effort.
Well, there are Indo-Bangladesh river summits, and it's held regularly, and not just on the issues of Ganges water sharing, also Tista and other rivers. It's an ongoing conversation. Um, Obviously, most of the rivers in Bangladesh are transboundary rivers. So any question of preservation involves the other side of the border. All I can say is that well, there are conversations, there are conferences on that. By conferences, I mean discussion between the different parties, the two parties, but it's ongoing. I can't tell you exactly what the outcomes are.
I have a question, but for that, could I give a sort of one sentence response to the question which was asked earlier as to why is it that the Bhagirathi, the Hooghly, it's to be thought of as a sacred river, whereas the
Right.
Padma is not? Maybe it has something to do with the presence of one or two important sites of pilgrimage, like the Tribeni of the Muktabeni in Hooghly district, and then Kalighat, Tarakeshwar, not too far away. I mean, I don't know. I mean, is there anything comparable on the Padma side? I don't know. It's a Tribeni, and then one of the 52 features of the Shruti. These would be two big draws. So the question was something else. You talked about the Reynolds explorations trying to open up new trade routes through the riverine system within the delta. Now, was there no trade early in such a sort of prosperous region as Bengal? Was there no trade earlier along these rivers? And the British afterwards, of course, they carried out their own river engineering on these smaller rivers also, and even excavated. I mean, recovered some rivers. They excavated some new canals. What effect did that have on the total deltaic system, and how much is the broader question with which I led? How much do these smaller rivers between the Padma and the Bhagirathi, how do they affect the overall balance of this region? And is it entirely a sort of one-way influence from the big rivers to the small, or is it something more two-way?
Well, I do discuss that in the book. Um, this forking of the Ganges going into Padma and towards Hooghly Bhagirathi, I've described it as creating two ecological axes. If you can imagine, at the point of the forking is the old city of Gore, which is kind of more or less near that point. And from Gore, you go down south, you're going along the Hooghly Bhagirathi all the way to Shagor Island. And then from Gore, if you go diagonally, if you can imagine that, which is the Podda River, and you actually land up in Bikrampur. So Gaud and Bikrampur formed another axis. If you want to rethink this riverine system, this basically these two riverine major spines, which Amartya Sen beautifully described it as two charismas of Bengal. And I argued in the book that trade was very important. In ancient Bengal, Sadgaon was a very important international trading port. And we know that Bikrampur and Sonargaon on the other axis until the 14th, 15th century was very well known. It was written up in European travel literature. Even the ancient Greeks talked about that. They talked about this sort of, well, now we say imaginary city, Gongaridai and uh, a description of a city that perhaps did not exist, but in their imagination, this was the final sort of, termination of a trade route that they had articulated. But in the 14th, 13th, 14th century, there was a major trade from the Bikrampur, Sonargaon area to East Asia, to China. The Chinese courts were constantly traveling along the coast of Sumatra and into Bikrampur. And I discuss the presence of Chinese ambassadors in Sonargaon, and especially the description of Mahuan. And then he describes what was going on, and there was trade on the eastern side to China and to the western side to the coasts of India and all the way to Africa, to empire that doesn't exist anymore, Malindi. And I just quickly mentioned that's a beautiful description of when Mahuan was in Bikrampur. Um, the team witnessed the gift of the king of Malindi to the Sultan of Bengal at that time, I think Jalaluddin Shah, the gift of a giraffe. And the Chinese had not seen that animal before, and they were just astounded. They thought it was the dragon, and they requested the sultan that they'd be given to them, that they could take it to the emperor in China. So just to mention that, and the Bengal sultan had written letters in gold to the Chinese emperor. So there was a thriving trade route between Bengal via Bikrampur and Sonargaon to China and Africa. So there was.
Amitav, would you like to say a little more about that? About this trade routes and the
Well,
connections and what the British did to that ecology?
Well, obviously the whole Chand Shaudagar story is all about trade,
That's right.
and we don't really know where he went because it's not clearly spelled out. But I mean, I think it's perfectly clear. Bengal was one of the leading centers of textile production. A lot of the textiles that went to Southeast Asia as well went from Bengal. A lot of the a lot of the textiles that went to East Africa, to cities like Zanzibar, which Abdul Razak Gurna has written about so beautifully. So I think all these connections existed through Bengal.
Any more questions from? I think there are people with their hands up. I can't see very well because I'm looking straight into the light.
Good evening. So, as you were talking about the river imaginary, so as we can see in recent trends that most of the efforts made by the institutions are towards protecting the river as a place, like building dam or procuring whether Ilish or hydropower. So, the nostalgia related to the river or the identity related to the river, like which was there maybe in case of the characters like Rajkumar in Glass Palace or maybe Fakir in The Hungry Tide. So the river as a space maybe is lost because of the urban landscape and because of the new generation. So what is your take on that? Like, is the river as a place is overshadowing the river as a space, especially in case of Podda? If
Well, in Bengal, the rivers can never disappear from your imagination simply because the rivers are so big. They're so vast and so incredibly powerful. You they can't vanish from your imagination in a sense. Also, I think the way we think about rivers, I mean, we think of a river as being a unitary thing, whereas in fact a river is more like a forest. I mean, it has so many different ecosystems inside it. Some of which just float along like bubbles. And they each have their own flora, fauna, etc. Especially because uh, the rivers of Bengal are so rich in silt. uh, you know, they have very active ecosystems all distributed throughout the waters. So there's a deep water ecosystem in the river. There are these shallow water ecosystems. So the river actually has a very dynamic character.
I must add to that, well, of course, there's scales to the rivers. Not all rivers are alike. Of course, you have the Podda, Meghna, and the Jamuna, and then there are innumerable rivers at various scales of existence. And of course, there are rivers which are being encroached upon, polluted. I can mention rivers around Dhaka. And that's because, well, of course, urban expansion, if you like, and not only it's sort of disrupting the rivers, but the ecosystem along the rivers, the wetlands, the floodplains, the agricultural lands, which is part of the not only the river itself, the flux of the river. So that also is happening. And one thing that we do at my institute is to kind of address that, where urbanism or city making, it's all about city making, expansion of the city, and our privileging the land, privileging dry land, so to speak. I mean, that's another thing that has happened, Amitav, this sort of confrontation of a dry ideology and a wet livedness. Bengal and the Delta is all about wet livedness, while more urbanity or the kind of urbanity that we have embraced is actually keeping ourselves dry. And I call it dry ideology. And all the sort of instruments that we have used for that, barrages, embankments, and so on and so forth, and other mechanisms, landfill and making cities on landfills. But that's a huge disaster ecologically, and we have seen that around Dhaka, which is to say, as if that city will be always confrontational to the deltaic river system. I argue that we need a third kind of, thinking, a third method, not just embracing the rivers as they are or proceeding with the city as we do, but another kind of urbanism which works with the rhythm or chondo of the rivers.
Thank you. That was incredibly well put. And we do need to find this third space, which is also a third rhythm, a third way of living, a third kind of urbanism. I don't know whether the organizers are gesturing to me to close the session, but can we have one more question? Yes. I think somebody wanted to.
I think it was worth the wait. So I just have one question. When we talk about civilization, say Indus Valley or say Egyptian, all are around the rivers. When you talk about rehabilitation, resettlement, this is a new word in the crowd. So you are not moving just people, you are moving the culture, you're moving the language. If I talk about Bo, the language we lost in 2010, how do we see this one build-up that is happening, infrastructure at one go, and you're losing a civilization at the other end? How do we balance the spectrum? Because the race of infrastructure is going to be moving at a faster pace in coming forward.
Well, I think what I just responded to earlier is in a way a response to your question. It remains confrontational up till now. What we call, I don't know if I received your question correctly. Um, the modern civilizational systems, as you see it, is at loggerheads with the natural system, if that's what you mean. And what we need to think about, as far as I'm concerned, as an architect and an urbanist, to think of a system that works with the rhythm of the both. It need not be confrontational.
I'd like to ask Amitabh also to give your thoughts about this idea of a third space, a lived space on the earth, the planet that we inhabit. to the peril of the planet and also to our own peril.
Well, it's what can one say? It's a rather sad circumstance right now, because exactly as you're saying, I mean, we are fighting these all these ecosystems, not just the rivers, but we are trying to impose different ways of life on an environment which is not suited to it. But this is happening not just here, but across the world. I mean, if you think of the Po River, which is one of the most, which also ends with a beautiful delta, but the Po River is now almost dry. There are long seasons when it hardly any water flow. You can walk across the Po River. It's unbelievable. This river used to sustain 30 million people. So I think this disaster that we see unfolding around us is happening everywhere.
But on the other hand, you also have tropical flooding in England.
Yeah.
Right.
Yes, so we have, we don't know whether the world will end in fire or in flood, but I think that living in deltaic Bengal, we have lived with the reality of a riverine landscape that is predominantly sort of controlled or, understood in terms of water. We have lived in this watery ecology. We have understood our lives as regulated by the courses of our rivers. And it would be very sad if that aspect of deltaic Bengal were to be lost, if the delta were indeed to recede, as you mentioned as you were going on. And I think that for this is not something just for people in Bengal to think about. There is Assam. There are other parts of this entire ecosystem. There is the Brahmaputra. There are other rivers, as Shukanto mentioned. There are other rivers that break off from the Ganga and the Podda, the Hooghly Bhagirathi and the Podda. And many of these rivers are now imperiled. This great novel by Akhtaruzzman Ilyas called Khwabnama is about a river called the Bangali River, which is now threatened by a shift in the course of the Jamuna, which is likely to inundate vast areas of Sirajgunj and Pabna. So, I mean, we have to live with these realities and we have to understand these realities better. Thank you very much for a fascinating discussion. Thank you for
Thank
what you said and for the book that you have given us.